I'd only been living in my new apartment for a week when I first noticed the noises. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just faint creaks and thuds, the kind of sounds you expect in an older building. The landlord had warned me about the thin walls, so I assumed it was the neighbors. But as the days passed, the noises became harder to ignore. At night, when the building was quiet, I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway outside my door. They were slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. At first, I thought it was someone coming home late, but when I peeked through the peephole, the hallway was always empty. One night, I heard the footsteps stop right outside my door. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. A faint tapping followed, like someone gently knocking with a single finger. It lasted for a few minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it started. I convinced myself it was nothing, just my overactive imagination. I'd moved here to get away from the chaos of my last place, and I wasn't about to let a few noises ruin my fresh start. But then, things started to move. It began with small things. A glass on the kitchen counter shifted an inch overnight. A chair at the dining table was slightly out of place. I thought I was imagining it, that I was just tired from unpacking and settling in. Then one morning I found my bedroom window wide open. I never opened that window. It overlooked the alley below, and I didn't trust the old locks to keep it secure. But there it was, the curtains fluttering in the breeze, the latch completely undone. My skin prickled as I closed it, making sure to lock it tightly. That night I heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't stop in the hallway. They moved inside. I lay frozen in bed, the faint creak of floorboards echoing through the apartment. The footsteps were slow, methodical, moving from room to room. I clutched the blanket to my chest, my heart pounding as they grew louder, closer. The sound stopped just outside my bedroom door. I stared at the doorknob, half expecting it to turn. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's voice was calm as I whispered, "Someone's in my apartment." "Stay on the line," she said. "Officers are on their way." The footsteps resumed, moving back toward the living room. I stayed on the phone until the police arrived, their knock on the door breaking the suffocating silence. I ran to let them in, tears streaming down my face as I tried to explain what had happened. They searched the apartment but found no one. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing out of place. One of the officers suggested I might have imagined it, the stress of the move playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe him, but the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and unshakable. The next day I bought a deadbolt for the door and a security camera for the living room. I needed proof, something to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. That night I set up the camera, positioning it to cover the entire room. I locked the doors and windows, double-checked the deadbolt, and crawled into bed, hoping for a quiet night. At 2:37 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. This time they weren't slow or deliberate. They were hurried, frantic, echoing through the apartment like someone running in circles. I sat up, my heart racing as the sound grew louder, overlapping with faint whispers I couldn't make out. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app, pulling up the live feed. What I saw made my blood run cold. The living room was empty, but the furniture wasn't where I'd left it. The couch had been pushed against the wall. The coffee table flipped onto its side. A chair spun slowly in the center of the room, as if someone had just released it. I stared at the screen, unable to move, as a shadow flickered across the frame. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, too thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. It darted toward the camera, and the feed went black. The whispers stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed a bag and left the apartment, vowing never to go back. I called the landlord and told him I was breaking the lease, but I didn't tell him why. I didn't think he'd believe me. A week later, I received an email notification from the camera's app. It had recorded something during the night. I almost deleted it without watching, but curiosity got the better of me. The video was short, only 10 seconds long, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. The footage showed my bedroom. The camera somehow moved to face the bed. I was asleep, my back to the camera, the blanket pulled up to my shoulders. And then, slowly, the blanket began to slide off. It didn't bunch up or wrinkle, as if someone was pulling it. It floated, smooth and deliberate, as if lifted by invisible hands. The video ended with the blanket falling to the floor. I haven't watched it again. I haven't gone back to the apartment, but sometimes, late at night, I hear it. The faint sound of footsteps pacing outside my motel door. There was something. The house wasn't supposed to be ours. It was one of those too good to be true listings. Spacious, affordable, and in a quiet neighborhood. The realtor mentioned it had been on the market for a while but brushed off our questions about why, saying people were picky, and sometimes a good deal just sat for no reason. We moved in on a warm spring day, eager to settle into our new life. The first week was uneventful. Unpacking boxes, painting walls, and arranging furniture. The house creaked like any old place would, but I didn't think much of it. It wasn't until the second week that things started to feel wrong. It began with the noises. At night, I'd hear faint whispers just loud enough to wake me, but too quiet to make out. Mark said it was probably the wind or the house settling, but I wasn't so sure. The whispers didn't sound like the wind. They sounded like voices, low and deliberate, as if someone was standing just outside our bedroom door. One night, I decided to investigate. Mark was already asleep, his soft snores filling the room as I crept into the hallway. The whisper stopped the moment I stepped out. I checked every room, every closet, even the basement, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was my imagination, likely a result of being overtired and overwhelmed. But then the door started opening. The first time it happened, I walked into the kitchen to find every cabinet door wide open, the contents inside untouched. Mark laughed and said I'd probably forgotten to close them after rummaging through for something. I knew it wasn't me. Another time I came home to find the front door wide open, though I was certain I had locked it before leaving. Our security camera footage showed no one entering or leaving, just the door slowly swinging open on its own. Mark tried to reassure me, saying it was probably nothing serious, but I could see the doubt creeping into his expression. We changed the locks, installed more cameras, and left the lights on at night. None of it helped. Then, one evening as we sat on the couch watching TV, I noticed something moving in the hallway. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but I was sure I saw a shadow darting across. I whispered to Mark that I thought I saw something move. My voice trembled as I pointed toward the hallway. Mark frowned and shook his head, asking what I saw. I told him I thought I saw a shadow, gripping the edge of the couch. He stood and grabbed the flashlight we kept by the couch, telling me to stay put. I watched as he walked into the hallway, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. He said there was nothing there, though his voice didn't sound confident. I joined him, my heart pounding as I stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder, heavier, like the house was holding its breath. Mark stood in front of the basement door, resting his hand on the knob. He asked if I had left the door open. I shook my head and said no, adding that I never went near the basement. The door was slightly ajar, revealing the dark stairs leading down. We rarely went into the basement. It was unfinished and mostly used for storage. Mark pushed the door open wider, shining the flashlight down the steps. He told me to stay upstairs and started descending slowly. I wanted to stop him, to tell him we should leave the house altogether, but I couldn't move. I stood at the top of the stairs, gripping the banister as he disappeared into the shadows. I waited in tense silence before calling his name and asking if he was okay. He reappeared after a few moments, his face pale, and said there was nothing down there. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder, more insistent, and I couldn't block them out. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the sound grew closer. It wasn't just voices this time. It was footsteps, soft, deliberate steps moving through the house. I shook Mark awake and whispered that I could hear footsteps. Mark listened for a moment and whispered back that he heard them too. We sat there in silence, the sound growing louder. It stopped just outside the bedroom door. I clutched Mark's arm, my breath shallow as the doorknob rattled. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. We stared, frozen, at the empty hallway beyond. Mark grabbed the baseball bat he kept under the bed, telling me to stay put. He stepped into the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. I waited, fear clawing at my chest, before whispering his name again and asking if he was okay. There was no response. I grabbed my phone and followed him, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The hallway was empty, the air unnaturally cold. I called his name again, louder this time. A sound came from the basement, a low guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I backed away, my hand gripping the wall for support. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway. It was tall and distorted, like a shadow that had stepped free of the wall. Its face was blank, a pale oval with no features, but I could feel it watching me. It raised a hand, pointing toward the basement door. I don't remember running, but the next thing I knew, I was outside, my bare feet cold against the pavement. Mark was beside me, his face pale and his hands shaking. We didn't speak. We just got in the car and drove. We never went back. The landlord called a week later, asking when we'd collect our belongings. I told him to throw everything away. I didn't care what it cost. He sighed and said we weren't the first to leave like that. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I was too afraid of the answer. It started with the front door. I live alone in a small one-bedroom house at the edge of town. It's quiet, peaceful, a perfect escape from the chaos of the city. But one night, I came home from work to find the front door slightly ajar. At first, I thought I'd forgotten to lock it. It was a long day, and my mind had been elsewhere. But as I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I checked every room, turning on lights as I went. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing missing, nothing out of place. I locked the door, double-checking it this time, and chalked it up to my own carelessness. But the next night it happened again. This time I was sure I'd locked the door before leaving. I even tested the handle twice before heading out. Yet when I returned, the door was open just a crack, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. My heart raced as I stepped inside. Again, everything seemed normal. No signs of forced entry, no missing belongings. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I called the landlord the next morning, asking if the locks could be changed. He promised to send someone out later in the week. Until then, I resolved to be more vigilant. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise. It was faint at first. A soft creak, like footsteps on the hardwood floor. I froze, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my phone and a flashlight, creeping out of the bedroom. The living room was dark, the faint glow of the streetlight outside casting long shadows across the floor. I swept the flashlight beam around the room, but there was nothing there. Then I heard it again. It came from the kitchen this time. A low, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the tiles. My breath caught as I stepped closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The kitchen was empty. I checked the back door, the windows, every cabinet and corner. Nothing. I tried to tell myself it was the house settling, or maybe the wind outside. But as I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few days, the noises continued. Footsteps in the hall, whispers just out of earshot, objects shifting when I wasn't looking. I stopped sleeping, the paranoia gnawing at me like a constant ache. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was faint, rhythmic, and unmistakable. My heart pounded as I lay there, too afraid to move. The sound was coming from the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the faint glow from my alarm clock. I reached for my phone, its screen lighting up as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm as I whispered, "There's someone in my house. Please send help." The breathing stopped. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that felt too heavy, too complete. I stayed on the line, clutching the phone like a lifeline as the operator assured me that officers were on their way. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder. One of the officers suggested I might be imagining things, the stress of living alone getting to me. But I knew better. The next day, I installed security cameras around the house. If someone, or something, was messing with me, I was going to catch it. That night, I sat on the couch, watching the camera feeds on my laptop. The hours dragged on, each creak and groan of the house amplified in the silence. Around 3 a.m., the motion detector in the living room went off. I stared at the screen, my breath catching as the camera feed flickered to life. The living room was empty, but the sensor's light blinked steadily, signaling movement. I switched to the hallway camera and froze. There was a figure standing at the end of the hall. It was tall, its form shrouded in darkness, its head tilted slightly, as if it were staring directly at the camera. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, dialing 911 again. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, watching. The operator's voice was calm as I stammered out what I was seeing. The police were dispatched, but the figure vanished before they arrived. They searched the house again, finding nothing, but this time they didn't dismiss my fears. One of the officers stayed outside, parked in their cruiser for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. The next morning I reviewed the camera footage. The figure was there just as I'd seen it. But when I rewound the video, it appeared suddenly, stepping into frame from an angle that shouldn't have been possible. 1 second the hallway was empty, and the next it wasn't. The footage gave me chills. Whatever it wasn't human. I decided to leave the house that night, packing a bag and heading to a motel on the other side of town. As I was locking the door, I felt it. A presence, heavy and oppressive, like something was standing just behind me. I turned, but the hallway was empty. At the motel, I finally managed to get some rest. But when I returned home the next day to grab more of my things, the front door was wide open. Inside, the house was completely still, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. My furniture was untouched, my belongings exactly where I'd left them. But the cameras were gone. Every single one of them, ripped from the walls. In their place were scratches. They covered the walls, deep gouges etched into the paint and wood. They formed no recognizable pattern, but their randomness felt deliberate, like a warning. I haven't gone back since. The landlord called me last week, asking when I'd be coming to pick up the rest of my things. I told him to throw them away. I don't care what it costs. I still don't know what was in my house, but sometimes, late at night, I hear it. The faint sound of breathing just outside my motel room door. There was something. When I moved into my apartment, I thought I had finally found a space to call my own. It was small, affordable, and in a quiet part of town. The building was old, with creaky floors and thin walls, but I didn't mind. It had charm, I told myself. Character. For the first month, things were fine. I worked long hours at the office, spent my evenings unwinding with TV or a book, and rarely saw my neighbors. The landlord had mentioned the unit next to mine was vacant, which explained the silence. But then, one night, I heard the knock. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic tapping that I almost mistook for the sound of pipes. I paused the movie I was watching and listened. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the thin wall between my apartment and the empty unit. I stood up, frowning as I pressed my ear to the wall. I thought I heard a faint shuffling sound, like someone moving furniture. It didn't make sense. The apartment next door was supposed to be empty. The noise stopped after a few minutes, and I shrugged it off. Old buildings made weird sounds, I told myself. It wasn't a big deal. A week later, the knocking started again. This time it was in the middle of the night. I woke up to the sound of steady, deliberate taps coming from the wall behind my bed. My heart raced as I sat up, groggy and disoriented. The sound was louder now, more insistent. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through the landlord's contact information. I wanted to call and ask if someone had moved into the vacant unit without telling me, but it was almost 2 a.m., and I didn't want to seem paranoid. The knocking continued for another 5 minutes before stopping abruptly. I lay awake for the rest of the night, listening for any other sounds. The silence was almost worse. The next morning I called the landlord. I asked if anyone had moved into the apartment next door. He sounded confused, telling me that the unit was still empty. I hesitated before mentioning the knocking. He said it was probably the building settling or an animal in the walls. He promised to send someone to check, but I could tell he wasn't taking me seriously. That evening I decided to investigate. I knocked on the wall where I had heard the tapping, half expecting a response. When none came, I stepped out into the hallway and walked to the door of the vacant unit. The door was locked, but something felt off. The air around the door was colder, and a faint smell of damp earth lingered. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sounds inside. For a moment there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint, scraping noise like nails dragging across wood. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and hurried back to my apartment. That night, the knocking came again. It started in the same place behind my bed, but this time it moved. The taps traveled along the wall, steady and deliberate, as if someone was walking with their hand pressed against the surface. The sound moved through the living room, down the hallway, and stopped at the wall by the front door. I froze, staring at the door, half expecting it to swing open. The air felt heavy, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the landlord, when I heard it again. This time it was coming from inside my apartment. The knock was soft, almost hesitant, coming from the closet in the hallway. My breath caught as I stood there, staring at the closet door. It was slightly ajar, the darkness inside almost swallowing the faint light from the hallway. I whispered to myself that it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But the knock came again, louder this time, as if to challenge me. I grabbed a broom from the kitchen, holding it like a weapon as I approached the closet. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking. The closet was empty. Just a few coats hanging neatly, and a pair of old shoes on the floor. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I closed the closet door, I noticed something. There were scratches on the inside of the door, long, deep gouges, as if someone, or something, had been trying to claw its way out. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with the lights on, the broom still clutched in my hands. Every creak, every faint sound set my nerves on edge. The next day I called the landlord again. I told him about the scratches, about the noises, but he brushed it off. He said old buildings had their quirks, and that the maintenance crew hadn't found anything unusual in the vacant unit. I considered moving out, but I couldn't afford to break the lease. Instead, I bought a lock for my bedroom door and started sleeping with the TV on, hoping the noise would drown out the knocking. It didn't. The sounds grew worse. The knocking turned into thuds, the shuffling became heavier, and the whispers started. I would wake up to the sound of faint voices, low and indistinct, coming from the walls. They grew louder each night, until I could almost make out words. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard my name. It was faint at first, just a soft whisper, but then it came again. Clearer, louder. I sat up, my heart racing, and stared at the wall. The voice called my name again, slow and deliberate, and then the knocking started. This time it wasn't just at the wall. It was at the bedroom door. I stayed frozen, too terrified to move as the door rattled in its frame. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, until it stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was unbearable. The next morning I packed a bag and left. I didn't bother locking the door behind me. I moved in with a friend and refused to go back, no matter how many calls the landlord made. A month later, I got a call from a new tenant who had moved into my old apartment. She asked me if I had ever heard strange noises at night. I told her to leave. She didn't listen.